Hi, people. I've come across a story on LBC, which I think is a good example of the sort of situation that the Metropolitan Police find themselves in. And it's one of those things that provokes a lot of debate. And I think it's a useful case study for looking at these sort of situations. I'm going to read it out. It's not too long. But before I get into it, let me just put a caveat. My purpose with this video is not to defend everything the Met does. I have been very outspoken about police brutality. I've been very outspoken about the importance of holding corrupt officers to account, not just to account. I think that police officers who break the law should be arrested, not put on desk duty, but arrested. So I'm by no means someone who is just knee-jerk defending those in uniform. That's not the case here. I am coming from the point of view, though, as someone who feels very strongly that the situation of youth crime is, I don't want to say out of control, but it's pretty bad in this country at the moment. Um, anyway, without further ado, I'll read out the report then at a bit of a conclusion or afterthought. And as always, let me know your thoughts. So this was posted today. Met to assess footage of police striking at teenager that shocked social media. That's that's questionable. The report's by Will Taylor. Okay. Phone footage shows officers hitting a person several times as they haul him to the ground in a fenced-off garden, which was then posted online and shocked social media users. The Met said police were called to Abbey Wood in southeast London to a report of a child being robbed by a group of males on June the 10th. The child was threatened with a bottle, and police went to an address to make arrest inquiries, the force said. Footage shot from the opposite side of the street from a viewpoint overlooking the garden was shared by Karina White, a cultural commentator, showing police striking a person who she said was a friend of a friend's son. Vested interest. Hey, Met Police, just wondering if this is reasonable and appropriate use of force to detain a 16-year-old child. Kicking and punching, she tweeted. This was after school. It's study leave for GCSEs anyway, and he had gone to see if his friend was okay as he saw police in his garden, and this is what the end result was. The police weren't even there for him. Met said property had been reported as stolen in the area was found at the address. One 16-year-old tried to make off but was detained and arrested with suspicion of robbery and possession of an offensive weapon, the force added. He had been bailed pending more inquiries. This will be assessed along with the officer's body-worn video footage by officers from the Directorate of Professional Standards, the spokesperson said. All Met officers know that any use of force must be necessary and proportionate and that they will be required to account for their actions. The video caused an outcry after Ms. White, who protected her tweets, posted it online. It's the fact that he's down and they're still dropping blows that gets me fuming, one Twitter user wrote. Uh, WTF, how are they going to assault a teenager like that, said another. That's the end of the report. Well, that point about Karina White, yeah, she's blocked comments on Twitter, which makes me wonder why. I mean, she's going to make these opinions and sounds like she wants an echo chamber. Um, Not surprisingly, she's a Black Lives Matter supporter. The suspect was black. She didn't put a racial connotation in it necessarily, but the thing that gets me is just focus on the fact he's 16. Now, I watched the video, it's not very long, it's about 44 seconds, and it does show the officers appearing that you can't see the suspect clearly, it's behind a fence, but it does look like they are kicking him, right? That may or may not be proportionate. It remains to be seen. It needs to be investigated. It is simply not clear. What is known is that the police were investigating reports of a mugging where an actual child, had been mugged with a bottle held to him. That's a appalling crime. Um, and what I really challenge is this idea that a 16-year-old is a defenseless child. They're not. Now, it may well be that the particular 16-year-old in this case was innocent, in the wrong place at the wrong time and mistaken for someone else, in which case the Met owe him an apology. But They will have had to assess the situation. Now, if they overstep the mark, then yeah, they should be disciplined, and it's wrong. But I have seen people say things like, "How do they justify, big burly officers beating up a 16-year-old child?" Wrong. A 16-year-old is not a child. A 16-year-old is a teenager, almost a man, right? Um, and I think those sort of people who are in the minority, I have to say, most people in this case are supporting the Met, but they're extremely naive because they don't seem to grasp that a 16-year-old knife suspect is potentially as dangerous as any other criminal. Um, I'm tired of hearing reports of gangs of teenage thugs literally beating people to death. There's no other way to put it. There was a young father um, up here in Cramlington, Northumberland. I say up here in the northeast, beaten to death by teenagers last year. A teenage boy was beaten to death in Holton the Spring, near Sunderland, by a gang who were out for trouble. 10 of them, who surrounded him like a pack of wolves. So these stupid people who think that a 16-year-old is harmless, they just don't live in reality. They don't understand that, particularly in a gang dynamic, a 16-year-old could be very dangerous. A 16-year-old has muscle mass, a 16-year-old could be quite strong. This idea that they're a defenseless child is incredibly naive. Incredibly naive. With that having been said, it should be investigated, and if it turns out that this suspect was the wrong person or they did use excessive force, then they need to be disciplined. It's wrong. There are areas the Met absolutely needs to improve. The treatment of female victims, for example. Um, there are areas the Met needs to improve. But I think with policing, it's a constant balancing act. People expect and want the police to arrest criminals. They expect and want the police to take action. So if a child has been mugged by a gang of thugs, people will expect the police to follow up on that. And frankly, there are certain, she calls herself a cultural commentator, read woke activist, who will constantly put up barriers because they will constantly insinuate racism where there is none. And I do wonder, would she be, now she didn't mention racism in her tweet. Twitter has word limitations, but I wouldn't be half surprised. I mean, she's blocked off comments, so goodness knows what she's saying. But I mean, she's blocked off the right to reply. But it wouldn't at all surprise me if she's pushing a racial angle because it's a black suspect. Would she be saying the same thing if it was a white teenager? I doubt it. I doubt it. Because Black Lives Matter are a racial centric movement. It's in the name. My one of my biggest issues with them as a movement is that they will not condemn crime. They will not condemn criminals. They will not condemn youth crime ever. Their whole focus is on police brutality. And I don't say that it doesn't exist. I don't say that, for example, the police never overstep the mark. And I think there are probably too many cases where they get away with it. There was this statistic recently published that something like a ridiculously low percentage of police complaints actually resulted in an officer being penalised. I forget the precise source, but it was something that was really didn't look good in terms of accountability. But I'm sick and tired of people making excuses for teenage thugs. And I think as a society, I think sentencing needs to be much tougher for a start. I think sentencing for teenagers is way too lenient, way too lenient. The sentencing council, they don't live in the real world when it comes to this. But I'll just leave it there. I'll let you look at the video. The video is in a link to the news article. It's not very clear. It does look like they're kicking the guy ostensibly when he's down. But if he'd been lashing out, if he had been refusing to comply and he potentially has a knife, the officers have a right to protect themselves, which means incapacitating that suspect, doing everything they can to do so. If that means kicking him to make sure that he loses his knife, potentially that's something they have to do. So it needs to be looked at objectively. and all the details need to be assessed. Now, if this was a case that you had 16-year-old black kid, any I say kid, teenager, and he's just walking along, minding his own business, and the police suddenly pounce on him, and I really don't think that's the case. I do think that there are people who will constantly push a divisive agenda. For example, recently on one of the bridges in London, I think it was Westminster Bridge, a man who was thought to have had mental health problems was tasered by the police, and he was apparently flailing a screwdriver around, and he died at the scene. I don't know if he fell over the bridge or what exactly happened, but the way that was reported was police arrived to tase suspect. Now, they would have again assessed the situation if that man was posing a threat to the public. Then, of course, they had to take some degree of force. So I'm not one of those people that always defend the police, and I don't agree with those who always defend the police. But at the same time, I think there are people who will always condemn the police and not look at the very difficult job they have, not look at what they have to assess in a particular situation. I have seen footage of Metropolitan Police officers acting very reasonably, being polite, trying to arrest a suspect, and they literally get surrounded by a group of people yelling racist at them because the suspect's black. Now, how can they be expected to do their job in those circumstances? Um, Let me know your thoughts. I'll put a link to the video.